for us, it's a great pleasure to be able to have these talks with you and with stakeholders more generally, with having finally the proposals for our new Pact on Migration and Asylum on the table. And you know that this has been the product of a very long process. It's been a long time in the making, and we feel that this time was really necessary to get it right, because the Pact needed to be, in our view, thoroughly pre-consulted, not only with the governments of European Union member states and the European Parliament, but also with international partners, with think tanks, with civil society. In this sense, we are, of course, very grateful for the role that ICMPD has played throughout this process. You've provided very valuable input and insights, and we thank you for that. And I look forward, I have to say, to hearing from Martijn Pluim how our proposals stack up to your expectations and your analysis. And this type of talk is also very useful for us as we now enter the phase where we discuss with EU member states and with our partner countries on how to take this approach forward and operationalize it. So yeah, you asked me about the main ideas behind the Pact, and I have to start by saying that one thing that was very clear from us from the beginning is that we had to draw very carefully the lessons learned from our previous attempt, and to ensure that this is really, we're talking really about a truly fresh start. We had some stumbling blocks that our proposals hit, that our proposals of 2016 hit, and we wanted to avoid them this time. First of all, by clearly drawing the line under what was formerly the Dublin asylum system, and making sure we start afresh. We recognize that this was a system that put a disproportionate burden, let's say, to those member states that are member states of first entry. It was not well equipped to deal with situations of crisis, and it ignored the basic fact that contrary to 2015, when we were faced with arrivals to Europe with a sudden peak of arrivals that was mostly comprised by asylum seekers, by refugees. Nowadays, we have to deal with a day-to-day basis of mixed and constant migration flows. The second lesson we had to take into account was, of course, that we have 27 member states around the table on a very complex issue. Those member states have very different experience migration very differently. They have different objectives and concerns. And to make sure that the discussions start on a solid basis, we had to ensure that what we put on the table includes something for everyone and addresses and acknowledges these varying concerns. And finally, I would say what was very clear to us from the beginning when designing these proposals was that piecemeal approaches would not work. And we had made this mistake, I dare say, in 2016, where understandably reacting to a humanitarian crisis, we had put a lot of focus into putting a solidarity system in place between member states. But this was not complemented enough by corresponding measures on responsibility, on strongest border procedures, and so on. So what we are trying to do this time is really avoid to fall in the trap of some largely artificial binary arguments of the past, you know, where we implied this is a zero-sum game, someone has to win, someone has to lose. Solutions have to be either about solidarity or about responsibility, either about a voluntary mechanism or about a mandatory mechanism, either about the EU or our partner countries or about the countries of origin and transit. So if you ask me what is the main idea of this pact, what is the novelty and the basic premise, is that we try to put down for the first time a holistic system, a holistic European system for migration and asylum that forms a full circuit and that is more effective and addresses migration comprehensively both inside and outside the EU. When it comes to the structure, the main pillars, as you mentioned, my vice president usually likes to refer to them, to visualize them as a house with 3 floors. As you know, we have three of them. The first one is the external dimension, and this is centered around strengthened partnerships with countries of origin and transit. In the second floor, we have a more robust management of our external borders, and this is a very, very important part. And finally, we try to put in place rules for internal organization for solidarity that are firm but fair, and ensure that those member states who have a need for solidarity receive it effectively in practice. So the external dimension is the focus of the talk today, so I will not spend a lot of time on that at the moment. I hope we will have a chance to discuss it in greater detail in follow-up. But I want to say already that there, what we have said very often in the past, in previous documents, is that migration is a global phenomenon. It requires global solutions, responsibility sharing, but very often this was left a little bit at the level of a declaratory statement. And what we want to do now is really translate this into concrete operational cooperation by using all the tools that the EU and our member states have at our disposal in a very coordinated manner. And we know that this cannot be done with a one-size-fits-all approach. So the Pact introduces this notion of comprehensive, balanced, mutually beneficial partnerships that are really tailor-made to each partner country's specific situation, interests, and needs. Secondly, we come to the management of the external borders, and there, under the new Pact, we have a new and mandatory pre-screening of all our external borders, which includes an identity, health, and security check. And it makes it possible to then direct people immediately to the right procedure. We also establish an obligation for our member states to put in place independent monitoring mechanisms to make sure that this is done right and in full respect of fundamental rights. We also propose more effective, more integrated border procedures at our borders that take a maximum of 12 weeks, and they allow us to decide very much more efficiently, hopefully, whether people are eligible for asylum or whether they have to be relocated or returned. And finally, we rely a lot on setting up a more effective system of returns. We propose the establishment of a new EU coordinator on returns. And we have novel elements, for example, enhanced role for our agencies, for Frontex, in the operational carrying out of the returns. And the third pillar is, as I mentioned, a stronger internal EU solidarity mechanism to support those member states that, because of their geography, are most confronted with migratory challenges and pressures, and make sure that they always get the support they need. What we seek to create is solidarity as the norm, a system of constant, of effective solidarity. And the system we propose has variations depending on whether we are talking about situations where member states are faced with migratory pressures, with certain member states are faced with migratory pressures or risk of such pressures, whether we're talking about search and rescue operations or about crisis situations. And what is new in this Pact is that we allow a degree of flexibility as to the form that this solidarity takes. So alongside relocation, we also introduce the concept of return sponsorship. And the logic behind that is that we provide a reassurance to those member states that are under pressure that they will always be alleviated, let's say, of the pressure of the same number of people, either through relocation or by another member state taking over the return procedure and supporting it either through financing or through diplomatic engagement and so on. And we feel that this is one of the crucial elements to really overcome the deadlock of the past amongst our member states and to put in place a system that will work in practice. So yeah, I don't know how long I've spoken, but I think I'll stop here for the first for this first introduction. I want to say, of course, that there are a number of elements that are not directly included in these proposals that we put on the table on the 23rd of September, but they will come in the coming months. These are important elements, and some of them have been already announced in the Commission Work Programme for 2021 that was published on Monday. They will include a strategy on the future of the Schengen area, but also several initiatives on legal migration, which I think is also very important for the people who are following this webinar today. So to sum up, we try to put something in place that really represents a circuit, a connected whole, a system where we have screening, border procedures, asylum procedures, solidarity, return, and partnerships with countries outside the EU working seamlessly. I have to say we are quite encouraged by the first reactions we got, both from ministers around Europe, but also from partner countries. I don't want, I mean, don't get me wrong, there has been nobody who wrote to us saying they claiming they love every bit of it, but we knew that it is a complex issue. What is satisfying is that everyone so far recognizes that this is a basis on which we can genuinely start discussing. And they also recognize that the stakes are simply too high to fail. So we remain optimistic.
Thank you. A comprehensive and complex package with many elements in it. May I bring in Martijn Pluim and ask him what he sees as the main takeaways, the highlights, and perhaps surprising elements of this new pact?
Thank you, Alex, and also thank you, Myrto, for the overview that you provided regarding the pact. I think it's one of the elements which is, for me, the most positive part of the pact. When the so-called migration crisis, the migration policy crisis de facto happened in 2015 and 2016, one of the biggest frustrations that I and many other people had was that we got discussions at the highest level in Europe focusing on relocation and who takes 500 and who takes 5,000, who takes 50,000. And a lot of political capital at that time was lost by discussions at the most senior level in Europe, by discussing issues which were of complete operational nature and where the principles underlying these discussions were not agreed upon. And I think what the pact offers us now is indeed a comprehensive package with quite a lot of also controversial topics, whether we talk about the return sponsorship or border procedures. There's a lot of elements there which for sure people can easily look at and criticize or ask, what are you talking about here? How is this ever going to work? But the discussion at least takes place on a completely different level. And I think that discussion is needed in order to get to a kind of a compromise position where we can see, okay, this is where we want to go as Europe. This is how we want to offer protection. This is how we would like to look at labor migration. And for today's discussion, this is how we want to build up the relationships with our international partners. I think that is something that we needed in Europe to start a discussion on this level. And so for me, let's say the biggest takeaway would be that we finally have a discussion on the most senior level in Europe on where do we want to go with all aspects of migration, not only return, not only border management, not only legal migration, but we talk about all aspects of migration. Now that is let's say one of the aspects. And the second aspect, of course, is the important interlinkages between and the dependency actually of the success of the internal part of the pact and the management of the external borders with the international cooperation. That this international partnership both can be beneficial for the partner countries of the EU, but also is essential as a component to make the border procedures work, and indeed also to make the internal solidarity mechanisms work well. And I think this is something which creates an interesting opportunity for balancing this cooperation and also for moving this cooperation forward. Whether we talk about facilitating return, improving return and readmission, and improving efforts for sustainable reintegration, to issues such as the talent partnerships, and a concept which has been inspired by the skills partnership, but which is adjusted to the European realities. And I think here you can see that, I mean, I assume that lessons were drawn from both bilateral initiatives which individual member states have taken, or also Switzerland with migration partnerships, but then looking at this from a much broader perspective and bringing the whole EU machinery, which there is, from Erasmus to trade cooperation to other aspects of cooperation, and making a link also to migration. I think here the language chosen in the Pact goes steps a little bit back from the direct linkage to conditionality and more for more, less for less leverage, without losing eye of the fact that there is a need for a balance of interests. There's nothing hidden here. To reach the objectives that EU member states, European Commission has with the interest of the partner states is there, and it is out in the open. The conditionality aspect is much less visible. And I think that is something that we have been, as ICMPD, arguing for a long time, to see how can you, in the area of migration, establish a very mature relationship with your partner countries and listen very careful to each other's interests. The recognition, the clear recognition in the Pact of the political sensitivities of certain topics. How can we work on them? I think this is, for me, the main takeaways. In the external dimension, the Pact offers clearly opportunities for positive relationships also in the area of migration, some which has been over the last years very often a very binary, to use the word of Maria-Myrto, relationship with I can tell you many anecdotes of missions that I had where I was talking to representatives of countries of origin and said, well, next week another white man will sit on the same place where you are sitting, telling me to take back my own people because it's an international obligation, and that is the only focus of that conversation. Whereas says, I want to discuss also that topic. It's not hiding that I would like to talk, that we should discuss this topic, but let's talk from the migration perspective in a less binary way, and actually looking also where there is common interest. Because also here in our cooperation that we have had as ICMPD on a bilateral level, but also within the various dialogues, you see very clearly that the situation is not so black and white. It's not us versus them, or there is a very clear opportunity for finding common interest and common ways forward. And I think that the Pact proposes a number of concrete instruments to make that possible. So I think I leave it here, but that is my first takeaways of the Pact, the first reading of the Pact. Thank you.
Thank you, Martijn, and thank you, Ms. Kanellopoulou, for providing this brief overview of the Pact. We shall focus, of course, on the external dimension, and you already mentioned the comprehensive, balanced, and tailor-made partnerships with non-EU countries. May I ask what this entails concretely? What novelties can we expect in this regard?
Okay, thank you very much, and many thanks also to Martijn for pointing out a few of the issues that I think we will definitely need to focus on moving ahead. I appreciate a lot the overview, and a lot of the thinking really aligns with what our intentions are. So I am encouraged by this first appreciation. When it comes to the external dimension, I wanted to start first of all by saying that in a discussion that is very complex, as Martijn said, often reduced to very difficult emotional subjects, we found that the external dimension, the strengthening of the external dimension, was really the one area where support by our member states was unanimous. In every meeting that the Vice President and Commissioner Johansson, the Commissioner responsible for migration, had in the run-up to the Pact proposals, this was emphasized by all our member states, that we need really to find a new, truly comprehensive approach to the way we approach migration in our external relations, to make it central to our engagement with key countries of origin and transit, and also to better focus and coordinate the way we work as EU with our member states in that respect. So you asked me, what does this entail? The Pact, the text of the Pact highlights itself 5 very precise areas of stepped up action. I will only mention them briefly now. First of all, protecting those people in need and supporting their host countries. We have a track record in this field, and we will, where necessary, scale up our commitment to make sure we continue to support refugees and displaced people, but also the communities that host them. Second, building economic opportunity and addressing the root causes. And this is really about, again, using the collective weight of the EU and our member states as the world's largest donor of development assistance, as a major investor, as a major trading partner, to not only contribute to economic opportunities, especially for the youth, but also help build resilience, fight poverty, fight inequalities, and really enable people to feel that they can work, they can innovate, they can create without feeling forced to flee their homes. And we realize this becomes all the more important in a context like the one we are going through today, with the COVID pandemic raging, and we will have to deal with the aftermath in that respect. Third aspect is strengthening migration governance. And when presenting the Pact, this was one of the things that President von der Leyen stressed very much, that saving lives is not optional. So for us, really, it remains a priority to make sure that people don't risk death trying to reach our shores. And we want to work together with partner countries to help increase capacities for anti-smuggling, for border management, for asylum procedures. We have a stronger involvement, as I mentioned, of our agencies of Frontex and EASO in that respect. And we will put forward next year an EU action plan to advance cooperation on anti-smuggling with the EU institutions, the member states, EU agencies, and third countries. The fourth area is, of course, and Martijn mentioned it already, stepping up readmission and reintegration cooperation. And this is, of course, an important aspect for us. It is the flip side and a necessary prerequisite for what we propose on return, on more effective return internally in the EU to work in practice. There, of course, we're going to look at our existing readmission agreements and arrangements and make sure they work in practice, see if it makes sense to conclude new ones, but also focus on, for example, stepping up voluntary returns and reintegration. And we will present a strategy for that in the coming year. Final aspect is legal pathways. As I mentioned, this is something we take very seriously. We want to work with our member states to transform the ad hoc system that we have now in place for resettlement schemes into something more permanent. We want to reinforce mobility schemes. We have this idea that Martijn already mentioned of EU talent partnerships. So there is a lot happening there. You asked me what is different, and I would say that the Pact really builds on a lot of progress that we have achieved over the past years. On all these elements we have been working, and the Prague process is precisely one of the ways that we have developed this approach gradually over the past years. But the Pact really now aims at a step change. And that means intensifying the way we work at all levels, bilateral through the partnerships that I mentioned, regional, but also multilateral, not only through our cooperation with the UN system, but also with opportunities we have like the post-Cotonou framework with African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. I want to emphasize one thing because it comes up quite often as a question. the Pact does not single out a specific list of priority countries. This is not the objective here. We set out really an overarching approach that we aim to pursue over the next years with all countries which are significant from a migration perspective, centered around precisely these tailor-made partnerships. And tailor-made means we do not begin everywhere from the same starting point. We do not progress necessarily at the same speed, and the mix of the elements that I mentioned before is not necessarily going to be the same. With many countries, for example, that are part of the Prague process, we already have a very advanced cooperation in terms of visa liberalization, border management, capacity building. So, of course, we will continue in the same vein, and we have, for instance, we will be designing, for instance, the objectives for the future of our Eastern Partnership post-2020, and these will reflect the new Pact approach, for sure. What is different this time, to conclude, and how is this a paradigm shift, which is the million-dollar question? I would say three things. First of all, compared to a few years ago, we understand that from all sides, and by that I mean even internally at the Commission and the European institutions, but also from our member states and our partner countries, there is now clearly an understanding that to be successful in our cooperation in this area, we really need to be multidimensional, as Martijn also mentioned. We are increasingly talking about and talking with countries which are simultaneously countries of origin, of transit, but also of destination, with many of them welcoming significant numbers of refugees and migrants. So we see a change in mindset and a willingness to address issues such as development, security, visa policy, investments, education and research in an integrated manner. Second point, again, contrary to a few years ago, what we have the privilege to be able to do now is that we don't have to somehow retrofit migration into our external financing instruments. We are at the start of a new EU multi-annual budgetary cycle. We have designed our proposals for our new external financing architecture to factor in migration as a priority. We say in the Pact very clearly that we will make use, a more strategic and policy-driven use of our bilateral programming to precisely support these comprehensive partnerships. And our proposals for the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, our main instrument in the area of external cooperation, which has a total envelope of over 70 billion euros for the next 7 years, include a 10% target dedicated precisely to migration and migration governance related activities, and they include flexibilities for times of crisis and so on. One final point that I think is very important and is different, I think, than in the past, is that we see a clear willingness from EU institutions and member states to work together in a much more coordinated manner and bring together their policies and tools. This, I think, can really help us to have a more effective outreach and operational cooperation. And we see, I mean, we've had over the past months under the German presidency, but also through initiatives from countries like Italy, Spain, and Austria, a series of initiatives, for example, in the area of anti-smuggling, with areas like the Western Balkans and North Africa that are very promising. And this is, let's say, the direction in which we want to continue working on.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of important issues you mentioned here, but before following up with another question on this part of the Pact, I would like to bring in Martijn and ask him how he assesses the role of migration dialogue, such as the Prague process, but also bilateral instruments in the Pact's operationalization. Sorry.
Thank you, Alex. It's a word that I also always try to avoid. Thank you, Myrto. That was, again, a very interesting overview of where you've been going. I think if I look at the dialogues that ICPD supports, on behalf of Europe and both the African, Asian, and Eastern European partners. There's a number of elements where I see an additional complementary role and a supporting role in the implementation. First of all, I think it is that from an information side, those dialogues allow for a balanced level of communication between equal partners where they can exchange about their priorities. In their non-formal setting, people tend to speak more freely. The representatives exchange very direct on what their individual priorities are, and as such provide an important source of information on overall and general priorities. Many of the dialogues on top of that have specific working groups. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the dialogues, they most of them are composed of regular, once in a 4 or 5 years, ministerial meetings, annual senior officials meetings, and then working groups which support the objectives and implementation of these ministerial conclusions. In these working groups, of course, you will bring together experts on particular issues, whether that is labor migration or return or asylum, which allows the establishment of networks of officials of these countries, European, non-European, in which they can discuss also here not only their priorities but also lessons learned, and as such are an important inspiration for improvement of practices. It is also an opportunity, and the Prague process is a great example of that, for implementing a number of sub-initiatives. So funded by, and in this case, the Prague process funded via the Mobility Partnership Facility, a DG Home instrument. The Prague process allows for both the development of specific policy papers, but also which again provide an important source of information for the development of concrete actions, but has also in the past served as a platform in which bilateral or sub-regional initiatives are being developed in cooperation between countries, both EU and non-EU countries, can be initiated. Whether that then takes place within the Prague process or not, but at least it stimulates, let's say, between the full multilateral cooperation and the bilateral cooperation, the objective, the opportunity to bring cooperation, which sometimes between countries, which not always are, let's say, the same level of cooperation programs that the EU has. Whether you can say you have, where you are, okay, some are the enlargement countries and some are the Eastern Partnership countries, and some fall under another instrument. And here to create networks of cooperation along migration routes, to take a whole of migration route approach, those platforms take an important, play an important role. And then I think finally, and we've seen that now, not to single out Prague process country, but I just came back from a non-Prague process country, from Afghanistan, and to be able, and which is an important partner within the Budapest process, if you only look, which of course now doesn't happen anymore, but if you would only look at the migration situation from Afghanistan and then its impact on Europe, you miss an important component of the cooperation that you would like to develop with such a country, placing Afghanistan and migration realities within the setting of the peace process, within the relations with Pakistan and Iran, with Turkey, etc. You get a much more comprehensive picture. And the same is true for all dialogues. So the migration realities for individual Prague process countries are very closely related to their neighboring relationships or with other migration partners. I think here the dialogues serve as important inspiration and actually essential component of international migration management cooperation, without which it would be much less effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Martijn. I would like to follow up to Ms. Kanellopoulou's previous intervention and dig deeper on these future partnerships, which shall bring together a wide range of policy areas, including, for example, education, development, visa policy, trade policy, agriculture, job creation, research, energy, environment, or climate change. Does this approach hint towards a stronger conditionality? We already mentioned the more for more principle. Shall partner countries be afraid of being pushed to cooperate, or is quite the opposite now the case? Ms. Kanellopoulou, please.
Thank you. I think here I can be a lot more brief because the answer is simple and it is no. So I emphasized earlier that our starting point for this pact was really to try to avoid getting tangled up in these false dichotomies that we had in the past. And this goes very much also for the external dimension. So we don't want to engage in a logic, and that's why it's not reflected in the pact of more for more. Is it more for more? Is it less for less? Is it quid pro quo? This is not the idea. This is really not about imposing conditions unilaterally. On the contrary, what we are trying to do is really to establish a comprehensive, a mature, a balanced partnership approach that takes into account the interest of our international partners, but of course also takes into account the interest of the EU. We have many common challenges, and first and foremost, as I mentioned already, this is putting an end to the loss of life, but also addressing shortcomings in terms of migration management, for example. So what we want is to work together with our international partners in a way that allows everyone to assume their responsibilities and to fulfill them effectively. Now, when we talk about a sustainable approach to migration under the new pact, we make clear that this is one of our strategic objectives. And when it comes to key countries of origin and transit, it is true that for us it cannot be considered simply as one of an infinite number of priorities. It is indeed central to our engagement, and the pact really represents our intention, conveys our intention to make it a key part of our overall relations with these partners. But the notion of these tailor-made partnerships really puts the focus on addressing each partner country's specific situations and needs. And that includes support to refugees, that includes, for example, as I mentioned, creating opportunities for creating economic opportunities and job creating opportunities, but also supporting return and readmission. And to operationalize this concept, what we need to do is to make sure that our means match these needs after the analysis and the dialogue we conduct. And to make sure that our EU assistance is really targeted where it is needed. So I mentioned before that we intend to do a more strategic and more policy-driven planning of our bilateral programming. And then, of course, we want migration to be there from the beginning, not just as an afterthought. So we want it to be a key parameter. We also intend to apply the same approach when, for example, considering proposals under the European Fund for Sustainable Development, to make sure that the proposals selected really have a job creating potential, really contribute to addressing the root causes of irregular migration. And of course, for an effective system of returns to work in practice, as I said before, we feel that enhancing cooperation on readmission with our partners is a key part of the puzzle. We don't want to address this issue in isolation, and I think that is a very valid point, what Martijn just made. This is also our experience. If you go into a dialogue that exclusively focuses on this, it's very rarely that you will have an operational results. So what we want is really to work on practical and very cooperative solutions to increase the number of effective returns. We will look at our existing readmission agreements and arrangements. We will see where options exist to conclude ongoing processes or to explore new ones. But of course, this is not about always, it doesn't need to always be about a formal process. Really, our focus needs to be on what works in practice. We, as I mentioned, intend to present a strategy on voluntary return and reintegration in 2021. And this will be developed with the active involvement of our partners. And we signal that we are indeed ready from the EU side to mobilize all our tools, all our policies together with the member states to really help improve cooperation on readmission and support partner countries' national strategies in that respect. For example, under the revised visa code, we already have a system whereby we can propose visa measures factoring in the existing level of cooperation on readmission. Now, as part of our asylum and migration management regulation, we foresee the possibility for the Commission to identify measures in other policy areas, additional measures that can help improve cooperation on readmission and return. And this indeed, once again, reflects this comprehensive approach we want to take, using all policies at our disposal, of course, in the context of a broader relations with the countries concerned, but also focusing on practical solution. What doesn't work in practice and what are the means we have at our disposal to make it work better. So yeah, in short, yes, no, this is not about conditionality. This is really about entering an era of part of a comprehensive partnership approach that works in practice. We are trying to normalize in that context the discussion on return and readmission, to de-dramatize it. And clearly, our preferred approach and the approach we will follow is one of dialogue and cooperation. We feel that this is actually not a softer approach. This is a more mature and more effective approach.
Thank you very much. From the perspective of a migration dialogue, this sounds very promising, of course, and we will try to support you in all these objectives also in the future. Martijn, coming back to migration, the Pact aims to support law enforcement, operational capacity, information exchange in partner countries. Based on ICMPD's rich experience in such initiatives, how do you see the Pact's ambitions in this regard, be it at national, regional, or international level?
Thank you. We didn't leave migration yet, but I'm happy we're going back to it. I think the Pact initiative, of course, again, the balance here has to be found and the links have to be made, as was already mentioned by Myrta, between the EU's own institutions such as Frontex, Europol, EASO, and the cooperation that can be developed on the international level with Europe's partners. I think also here there's a number of initiatives which are ongoing, where you can say, can we support the development of the exchange of regional law enforcement cooperation? There is an initiative ongoing in the Budapest process, regional law enforcement cooperation, facilitating cooperation between some of the Silk Route countries, where MOUs are being developed and operational cooperation is being developed in a highly sensitive geopolitical area on a topic which is also difficult. But I think here the ambitions are right. We need to share more information, and to be able to share this information, you need to work a lot on trust building. And trust building, there is a number of ways how to do that. One of the most important is to be aware of each other's capacities, ambitions, and objectives. And I think the different elements and the components that the Pact offers, which of course builds upon decades of operational cooperation in the area of migration, in the area of capacity building, operational support, etc., etc. The ambitions and the tools which are set in there could really help. If you would have in the area, whether that is in law enforcement or in other areas, capacity building initiatives which enable partner institutions, which empower partner institutions to do their work better, using practices which have proven to work. You for sure can build in progress, where you can say here the operational capacity for the national authorities is improved and not being taken over by other partners, but being taken over by the national authorities which have the mandate to do this. What we try to do, and based upon the experiences that we have in the last years, I think it's very important that we seek to promote interagency cooperation between the relevant institutions. Consultation mechanisms that work on a European level, on a national level, can inspire also actions in other countries. If we see that establishment of, in the area of border management, for example, interagency working groups have led to direct and very positive results. And here I would like to stress that when we talk about border management and we talk about border governance, we try to talk about that in ICMPD. It's not about pure security focus. It's also on promoting mobility. It's on promoting trade facilitation and increasing security and increasing information exchange, be better in risk analysis, scenario planning. If you bring together customs and border police and border guards, trade facilitations, national intelligence agencies, and you have them work together to share information, understand the common objectives, these kind of initiatives are proven extremely valuable in the cooperation. I think here, when this kind of initiatives are supported on national level, it also allows for closer cooperation between relevant EU agencies and say, okay, the information and the cooperation that I can set up with partners to stay in the Prague process region in Eastern Europe or Central Asia actually can be based on a basis of trust. And like that, I think we can really move forward in reaching the objectives that are set by the Pact, both for European level as well as for international cooperation.
Thank you. I would like to conclude with one issue that was just briefly touched upon, namely the regular call for establishing or widening the legal pathways and labor migration opportunities to the EU. We know that the Pact, of course, promises talent partnerships, but that there will be a separate package communicated next year by the Commission. But may I ask you, Ms. Kanellopoulou, already now about what to expect in the area of legal and labor migration? Will there be legislative changes in this particular policy area? And what is it that you can already announce now?
Yes, indeed. I can give a few more details, even though, of course, as I said already at the beginning, for us this is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. It's a very important topic, but we felt indeed that it deserved to be addressed in a manner that detangles it from the discussions about irregular migration. So, indeed, our idea, and there is a public consultation currently ongoing, is to look at this longer term and to come in the coming year forward with a package on legal migration, skills and talent. We know that we have an aging population, we have skill shortages in Europe, and I'm not just talking about highly skilled workers. We recognize this in our skills agenda that we presented earlier this year, and we also know that it is a keen interest of our external partners, of our partner countries, when we come to these comprehensive discussions that we already mentioned. They want to see more legal pathways for their citizens to come, live, work, and study in the EU. So even though, of course, it is our member states who are responsible for deciding on the number of labor migrants and that they admit, what we aim at is to put a framework in place at EU level that makes it possible for member states to manage legal migration more effectively and to indeed create better legal pathways to Europe. The Pact, first of all, highlights that we have some unfinished business to take care of, and that means completing the work on reforming the EU Blue Card Directive. We hope to see it adopted soon. But indeed, also in legislative terms, we would like to go further than that. We announced already that we plan a revision of the directive on long-term residence, and there again we aim to create a true long-term residence status for the EU, in particular by strengthening the right of long-term residents to move and work in other member states. We also have this idea of developing an EU talent pool. The idea is to have a system in place that helps matching the skills of third country workers with the needs of EU employers, and thereby facilitating their move to the EU. And we also have announced a review of the single permit directive, and this aims at simplifying, at harmonizing the procedures for admission and the resident conditions for low and medium skilled workers. So this is not just about highly skilled workers, as I mentioned. So what we have done over the past years is already start to build a certain expertise through pilot projects on legal migration. And our intention indeed is to scale up these schemes that are meant to match people to the labor market needs. We propose to develop these EU talent partnerships. We have to, of course, design them very carefully to avoid brain drain, to make sure that they become part of a circular migration logic. These partnerships can also have a component that focuses on capacity building in areas like building the knowledge base on labor market needs, or vocational education and training. So once again, the intention is to start testing this concept of talent partnerships with the EU neighborhood, the Western Balkans, and key partners in Africa. But depending also on how big the buy-in is from our member states, why stop there? We want to start next year, planning a high-level conference on that, and let's see how far it goes. The other aspect, as I mentioned already, is fostering pathways for resettlement. We have a recommendation that aims to formalize the ad hoc scheme of the about 30,000 places that we now have being implemented by member states, but also to establish options like community and private sponsorships for resettlement. And finally, we want to put, we feel it's an important part of this comprehensive approach to legal migration, to put a renewed focus on integration. And we are working currently on an action plan on integration and inclusion, which will also cover third country nationals. And we are factoring in, we are already planning an increased support to stakeholders, including EU local authorities, regional authorities, to support the integration of migrants in the local EU communities. So once again, really trying to create a full circuit, a system that works from beginning to end.
Thank you, very promising. I would maybe like to come back to this issue and ask Martijn about the COVID-19 impact. Nowadays, the appetite for legal and labor migration across the EU has probably reached a new low. Is there any chance and prospect for increased mobility in the near or midterm future?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think that what the health crisis did in the beginning, and to a certain extent also now, is to bring appreciation for the role that many migrant workers play within the EU, within the social system, within the health system, but actually in the wider economy also. And indeed, there's a number of member states whose systems would have failed without the contribution that migrants from also Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia would have brought to the system. I think that part has become very clear that not maybe throughout the whole population, but at least among policymakers, this has become much more visible on the radar. Now, do we need, if we want to look at, will this lead to increased mobility, or is there any prospect of increased mobility? I think the complexities of the migration realities in the Prague process region are, or the interesting part of it is that there's mainly two regions or countries of destinations where many migrants would go. And of course, that is on one hand the Russian Federation, on the other hand the European Union, with some other individual states also attracting migrant workers. I think that's already an interesting aspect to see, is what will be the midterm impact of the COVID crisis be on the migration trends towards these countries. Secondly, what needs to be recognized is that in the vast majority of the countries that we speak about, the non-EU countries we talk about, there's also a demographic shortage in the mid and long term. There is a declining population in many of the Prague process countries, both EU and non-EU. So we also have to be very careful at ensuring that whatever kind of mobility processes we are looking at takes into consideration the mid and longer term interest of the countries, the national countries involved. And thirdly, and now going back to the EU side, labor market access and policy there is extremely complex. It's first of all, it's a member states issue, and in the individual member states, they have very different systems. There's federal systems and more national centralistic driven systems. It demands the involvement of a large number of partners, apart from Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Labor, etc., etc. You talk about skills recognition and recognition of diploma. So the topics we talk about with regard to the promotion of labor mobility and supporting for that are complex and need to be addressed on individual and partnership level. I think what the EU, let's say what the European Commission can offer was already outlined by Myrto. It's promoting a number of pilot initiatives. It's improving, let's say, those parts of the regulatory and legislative framework where which offer the conditions for improved labor migration or increased labor migration. But again, I think here I'm not necessarily sure that in the midterm this COVID will be the main impact on labor mobility. There will be some changes, but I think that from a narrative perspective, I think we don't have to be looking at it too much. It's there might be jobs which actually will shift it out. We've seen that in certain regions that where there first was a demand for, okay, maybe we bring in workers from North Africa to an EU member state. Why don't we shift those jobs to North Africa? We have seen that how teleworking can work. Maybe there is a shift that we will see in jobs that actually will leave the EU and move abroad. Again, so I cannot give you a single message here like, will there be an increased mobility or will it affect increased mobility? There's numerous factors which will have an impact. COVID might be one, and the economic impact of COVID might be one. But I think it is too much to say that it would be pure focus on COVID. The narrative that let's say the concerns that people have with regard to international mobility go beyond migration. It's international tourism. It's all these other aspects which might be impacted, and which we all jointly should work on. to take away that fear, so that it's possible to have free travel and mobility, and then not link it to the fear for foreigners in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you both for answering these questions so comprehensively, and I would